Welcome, everyone, to our virtual event, Policing, Protests, Racism, and Mental Health, brought to you by Fountain House. I'm Dr. Ashwin Vasan, the president and CEO of Fountain House. I'm so pleased to be a part of hosting this virtual panel tonight and to share the Zoom stage with such a great moderator and a great panel to talk about an intersecting set of issues that's really front and center of our nation's attention, which is racism and its impact on our well-being and our mental health. What we're seeing is police violence, but also the impact of the pandemic coming together, and it's infusing every aspect of our nation's social structure and what people are crying out for, which is fairness and justice and equity. For those of you joining us who aren't familiar with Fountain House, for more than 70 years, we've worked with people living with mental illness to overcome social isolation and to build the community and the resilience needed to thrive in society. Fountain House is the most widely replicated community-based support model for people living with mental illness in the world, with more than 300 affiliated programs in the US and in more than 30 countries. It was started with the belief that people living with mental illness needed a safe place in the community where they could go to rebuild their lives, and that giving back people choice, dignity, possibility, while also providing the basic building blocks of a better life, including healthcare, housing, jobs, and education, all the things that mental illness itself take away from people, as well as our punitive and sometimes inhumane systems, offers up an alternative to the status quo for people for whom we often don't have aspirational visions for the future. The people who come to Fountain House and to the dozen other clubhouse rehabilitation programs in New York City and the hundreds of others around the country and the world are among our nation's most marginalized and stigmatized. At Fountain House, both our Manhattan base and our Bronx clubhouse, most of our members are people of color. Around 40% have a history of homelessness. Many have chronic co-occurring physical health conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes and heart conditions, and at least a quarter have been involved in the justice system in some way. In the worst case scenario, in 2016, a beloved member of ours, 67-year-old Deborah Danner, was shot and killed in her own apartment by the police on what was supposed to be a routine wellness check. Why are we at this event? Why did we put this on? Let me say briefly, I'm a primary care doc and a public health doc. And to me and to us at Fountain House, we think of mental illness as a public health issue that requires public health solutions based in the community, based in fairness and racial equity, and based in equal access to what are called the social determinants of health, but are really just the basic building blocks of a healthy life. This includes basic safety and trust in our criminal legal system, which for most Black and Brown Americans is non-existent. And for good reason. Mental illness is not a police problem, even though 1 in 4 killings at the hands of police are of people like Deborah, people who live with chronic mental illness. And disproportionately, we know that Black Americans, Black and Brown Americans, are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than white Americans. And that same racial divide exists amongst people living with mental illness as well. If someone is having a heart attack or a stroke, what you want is a doctor, not the police. And that's also what you want if someone is having a mental health crisis. And tonight we'll have an opportunity to discuss other options that would have kept people like Deborah alive. It's not just about police though. We have a system that sends Black people and mentally ill people into incarceration and into the justice system, that has people living on the streets. We have rampant unemployment and income inequality, which is leading to an ever-growing crisis of lack of health insurance and access to health care, a looming rent and eviction crisis on top of an affordable housing crisis that predated the pandemic, and separate and unequal education systems. Failures in each of these systems and the chronic stress and the trauma these failures cause not only represent upstream causes of ill health, they are exacerbating our mental health crisis and leading to a looming second pandemic of mental illness that will grip our nation for years to come unless we act in an intersectional way to address basic human security. The pandemic has simply taken these pre-existing conditions and exacerbated them, and it speaks to the fact that our mental health is not just a product of health care, but really the communities we live in, the environments we live in, and the systems that affect those things. So I'll be joining our panel when we get to questions, and we'll have an opportunity to say a bit more later. But with that, I want to thank you again for being here. And I want to turn it over to our moderator, Tanya Rivero, a correspondent and anchor for CBS News and a longtime friend of Fountain House. Tanya, over to you.
Ashwin, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us here this evening for this really important discussion. I see this sort of a Venn diagram, as it were, of issues, each one which is sort of a universe in and of itself, but that overlap in a pretty significant way. And so thanks to everyone for joining us and to our expert panel. I'm going to dive right in. Davida Kilgore, I'm going to ask you the first question. Davida is a therapist, writer, artist, and Fountain House member. Davida, can you speak to your experience as a Black woman trying to get adequate mental health care?
Yes, I was diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder in 1985 after my mother died. And for the life of me, from 1985 until I moved to New York in 1997, and then 4 years after that, got my first psychiatrist of color. I couldn't find a Black psychiatrist. I couldn't find a Black therapist. And I did not trust a white doctor to understand where I was coming from. So I battled it out by myself. I was raising a child by myself. My poor son just kind of got dragged along with me. We went through a brief period of homelessness, but doctors kept giving me medication that I kept saying, I know my body. I know what my body does. I know how my body functions. And this medicine is killing me. And I figured I'd rather take my chances with the highs and lows than the medications that weren't working for me. So I went it alone until I found a clinic in Upper Manhattan. My psychiatrist was a Hispanic woman. She was fabulous. Now, my therapist was a white Southern man, and I was like, there's no way in hell we have anything in common to talk about. But it actually turned out to be a relationship that worked really well. But part of all of that, including a professor when I was finishing my BA, convinced me that I should be a therapist, that I had actually been doing therapy all my life. Living in the Black community, we just kind of grow up solving each other's problems if we can.
Right.
And I just always use the arts to help people solve problems. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, Davida, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to turn to Dr. Richard Dudley right now, who is a clinical and forensic psychiatrist. I'm sorry. So Dr. Dudley, I imagine that nothing that Davida just said there surprises you.
Not really. We were talking just before we went on the air about this, actually. The training to have ethnoculturally competent mental health professionals is still poor, even though all the schools say that they want to do this. I mean, that they think they can do it like in a lecture or two. But the understanding of really integrating everything that we know about ethnicity and culture into our work takes more than a lecture or two. That just doesn't happen yet. But even if it did happen, and there was this kind of world of ethnoculturally competent mental health professionals, there's still going to be a subset of people whose lived experience was such that it'd be still difficult for them to obtain treatment from someone from a culture other than their own, just because the traumas that they have endured are such that that they couldn't even work with a therapist who wasn't from their own background.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to turn now to Dr. Rochelle Brackney, Chief of Police at Charlottesville, Virginia. Chief Brackney, it's so exciting for us to have you with us because obviously right now policing is a very important piece of this conversation, and to have your perspective is just crucial. How big of a problem would you say racial sensitivity and mental health acumen is within U.S. policing.
So thank you, and thank you for having this really important conversation at this time and at this nexus when we have the opportunity to make some changes. So race, ethnicity, cultural competency, cultural professionalism are really foundations for how we should be engaging. But the problem is with this, is that policing right now is about 70 to 80% white male. So there's a majority culture that may not have had any exposures to different populations, different lived or shared experiences of people that they may have to come into contact with who are experiencing distress or are experiencing a mental health crisis. And when you're trying to reach back into your lived experience bag, as Davida was saying, so that she could have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, counselor, a clinical mental health professional who she didn't have to lay the foundations for what her experiences might be, that would have been crucial to her being able to get on her pathway to being healthy faster and much more successfully. That is not the experience of the majority of the persons who are currently embedded in the law enforcement profession. And I'm not taking away from those experiences that may have been part of their life that had nothing to do with the fact that they're a majority. But when you're looking at an 80% white male profession, and the population they're going to deal with often doesn't reflect their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, who you might have that natural empathy for and want to move them from the circumstances where they are to where they could be, it is really challenging. And then trying to layer in what the laws say about how you interact and what resources that you have to support that interaction.
So you make such a very good point. How are you addressing that within your own department?
So absolutely. Since I've arrived here, it's only been 2 years since my arrival, and I came after the events of August of 2017, partly because of the work that I've done in restorative and procedural justice and transformational cultural change in policing. And the way that you first have to do it is you have to first understand, and what we've done here is we set the tone and culture that if you're not value or vision aligned with the way that we treat our community, then this is not going to be a place that you're going to survive very long, right? You're going to find an exit strategy. You don't ever go to someone's house over and over again if you don't like being there, right? It's kind of hard to sit at that table over and over when you're thinking, this isn't a healthy space for me. So here we have constant meetings about what does the culture look like and how do we serve the community in a way that they deserve to be served. And if you start thinking of it from a human aspect, and that the community deserves to be treated a certain way, and that public health and public safety are not competing priorities, it's a lot easier to think about and address cultural issues. In addition to the formal trainings that officers get about implicit bias and things of that nature, you have to try much more creative ways. It's a relationship that you build with your community. It is not a program or a process that you build. And part of building those relationships, we started something called 100 Conversations, where our officers need to go out and meet people they've never met before, who they don't have a contact with. It might be the clerk behind the convenience store counter that you get involved with, to just really get to see who that person is behind there, and then start a relationship with them so that you then can address the needs in a much more deeper, richer way.
That idea of a relationship with the people in the community that you are policing seems to me so crucial, because especially when it comes to mental health, if you know the people in your community, you know who might need a different kind of help. And there's so many cases when, especially in communities of color that may not have the same resources, there are people who are not, they're not criminals, but their behavior becomes criminalized. Dr. Dudley, can you tell us how important it is to have community policing that takes into account the I don't know what word to use, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the trauma of the generational violence that some of these children may be exposed to.
Well, I think it goes back to what the chief was saying, that it's just so well established that to change these patterns, it's really based on a close relationship where you begin to really understand what someone else's life experience is like and how that has impacted on them. And you can't really learn that from a lecture, and you can't really learn that from kind of casual interaction. It has to be something more intense than that. But in so doing, one of the things that you'll discover in many communities is the kind of repeated exposure to traumatic experience that children and many of the teenagers there have endured, and how that's impacted on them and their ability to function. And for police who don't understand that, they end up interacting with these children and adolescents in a way that make problems worse, as opposed to interacting with them in such a way that de-escalates difficulties. And if those children were raised by parents who experienced the same sort of traumatic experiences, then that's going to impact on their ability to parent and help their kids as they're growing up. And so that it just gets passed on from one generation to the next in the absence of adequate mental health services that attempts to try to help people cope with the traumas that they endure. We know how to do that. We know how to intervene. If there were ethnoculturally competent interventions used by the mental health professions to try to stop that cycle.
Right. And towards the end of this discussion, we're going to get to the exciting part, which is sort of the solutions and some of the ways that we can take all the energy of this current moment. Something that's so exciting about this moment is that people really are optimistic that this can bring on change. And so I really want this discussion to end with some concrete ideas from all of you about how that might happen. But Davida, I want to turn to you again. You're there, in St. Paul. Can you tell us what you have experienced, what you participated in, what it's been like to be there at sort of ground zero of the movement that we're seeing across this country?
Well, I think part of it is, now I have mobility issues, so I have a problem getting around. It's just hard for me to physically get around. And I had my home health aide drive me through my neighborhood. And I looked at the boarded up stores and everything, and I thought, this is the city that when I first arrived here, I was marching to make Dr. Martin Luther King a holiday. And every year I would get out there and I would do my march until I got tired. And then I would get my car and pick up kids because they were freezing, and we go marching. And since I've been here since the murder of George Floyd, it's been, I can't believe it. My son has been out there trying to help and work and protect people. I mean, I have a Black son, I have Black grandsons, I have Black great-grandsons. The conversations that you wouldn't think you'd have to have, you have to have now. I was at a point where realistically, even before COVID hit, I was isolating anyway. But when this happened, it was like, I want to be out there. I want to march again. But then there are physical aspects that just don't allow me to do it. So I've been trying to do, what I do. And this is why I'm a writer and I'm an artist. And this is where all of that comes into play. I write about what's going on. I paint and draw and create about what's going on. Because for me, being an artist is just taking chaos and creating something constructive. And that's what I've been trying to do since this happened. I go on Fountain House's community Facebook page. I try and talk to people. I try and say what's going on, but you do what you can do where you are. And so if you don't do something, then you're part of the problem. But mine is always to take it back to who I am. I am a writer. I am an artist. I had a career as a therapist. It's different. And I didn't want to deal with children because I thought it would be too much because I have my own childhood issues.
But you share your perspective through art, which is wonderful.
Right.
Chief Brackney, I want to get your perspective as being on the side of law enforcement. What are your feelings about the protests? Do you feel in some cases they go too far? Also, what are your thoughts about calls to either defund police departments or redirect some of the, city budgets away from police departments toward other social services? Sorry.
So language is important. I have really pushed the narrative that these are not protests, these are not riots, these are not civil unrest, or anything like that, because when you originally start adding negative language to it, then you enable people to dehumanize those persons participating in that civic engagement act, or that act of civic engagement. Here I use over and over, these are marches, these are rallies, these are persons demonstrating and exercising their right to gather and hold government accountable. So, and when you frame it that way, it really does allow you to look at it through a very different lens in how you approach what may appear to be a problem to some, but for me, is an understanding of pain and rage and demanding answers from a government who has refused and has ignored their communities and their constituents for decades and centuries. And those that ignoring has been done in a lot of ways. That there has been a slashing of funds towards mental health. There's been a slashing of funds towards our education. And we've taken the most expedient route and given those responsibilities to law enforcement to deal with, because society has chosen to use their resources in a lot of other ways. And then when there's a real issue or crises that they face, government will do exactly what it always does, take the most shortest, convenient, expedient routes to solve a problem, even if it's temporarily. So when we talk about defunding the police, I talk about a redistribution of responsibilities. So if you redistribute the responsibilities, then you should redistribute the resources to go towards those responsibilities. If you do not, and I believe police should not be involved in a mental health crisis, we should be able to support those who are in a mental health crisis and the resources that are there, but we should not be the lead on this. We should not criminalize a person who is in crises and may be experiencing suicide ideation, and then we introduce possibly additional trauma, don't understand their cumulative trauma that they're experiencing, or what other secondary traumas they may be experiencing on top of the triggers of seeing uniforms, guns, authority, government, who may not have served them well up to this point. So I am very comfortable with the redistribution of responsibilities that are well-resourced and well-equipped to address the issues.
Chief Brackney, can we clone you and send you to every police department in America? I think we'd be living in a very different country.
You know what? Shout out to my Charlottesville community who is very much challenging everything that I have learned over the decades in this, but they should hold us responsible and they should hold us accountable. And it's not always easy to have difficult conversations. So I may need Dr. Dudley's help at the end of this, or Davida, if you've got some services you can offer me. I may need those.
I have some things to offer you.
Well, this is all just so wonderful. Dr. Dudley, can you speak a little bit your experience? I know you work primarily with African-American youth and young men primarily. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience through your years of work, understanding what some of their specific challenges are?
I was excited by what the chief said, but wanted to add that some of those resources should certainly be directed towards addressing problems that we know are out there. And so that many of these youths would never come into contact with the police or the criminal justice system if there was some assistance for some of the difficulties that they have had. Your earlier question on trauma is a perfect example of that. As a forensic psychiatrist, I mean, in so many of the cases that I've worked on, I've seen the most incredible histories of trauma and the symptoms that result from that, to contact with the criminal justice system. And you can't help but ask yourself, why was there not access to help for these children when they were growing up, and even when they became adolescents? It could have really redirected their lives.
Right. We talked earlier, you and I, about how significant it is, those first brushes with law enforcement that many teenagers have. I mean, like I said, I grew up in a middle-class town in Texas where many of my girlfriends shoplifted, right? But that's something teenagers sometimes dabble in. But they were treated differently than you might see a young African-American boy or girl treated by the police in some neighborhoods of New York the first time they try shoplifting or something. And so these, obviously no one's excusing criminal activity, but the way that police respond to these low-level teenage behaviors is very important and sets the stage for what could happen next. Correct, Dr. Dudley?
Well, the presumption, I think, that's so much a part of racism, that these kids are bad before they do anything.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that whatever it is that they do ends up being criminalized and just a way of confirming what people already thought, that they were just bad kids, as opposed to, like you said, involved in not atypical adolescent behavior or something very low level, or a reflection of other difficulties that they've had that there's never been any services to address. And so I think all of that comes into, and against the historical backdrop of just the criminalization of so much that's happened in the Black community. Whether it's, the criminalization of drugs versus now we have a public health epidemic around drugs, a criminal response to a substance abuse difficulty.
Right.
So there's that backdrop as well.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about, Dr. Vachon brought up earlier Deborah Danner, who was that Fountain House member in 2016, who was shot in her apartment in the Bronx when a neighbor called police saying that she was acting erratically. Just this past weekend, George Zapanitis, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was tased to death by New York City police. He also suffered from mental illness. Also, there was a phone call from a neighbor complaining about some sort of erratic behavior. Chief Brackney, you mentioned this earlier. You said you don't think that police should be involved in mental health issues at all. And I would agree with you. I think it's an unfair burden for police, and it is a sort of a case of society shirking its responsibilities to these people. What are some suggestions you have on how to deal with that? I know that there's a program in Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots. I know that there's a program in Pittsburgh, Resolve, that I think you may be familiar with. How would you like to see situations like this dealt with?
So if we start on the premise that the more interventions, the more police interventions that occur, the more likely you're going to have some negative outcome. That even if everything goes well, the likelihood that something does not, if you even go everything by protocol, there could be a negative outcome. I think that the police are going to have to support mobile crisis teams, that you're going to have to support those type of mental health professionals, social workers that may be dispatched into the community very quickly. There are lots of ways that we have, creative ways that we can handle this. In Pittsburgh, they do have a group called Resolve. That is a group that has been in existence for now more than 10 years. I retired from the city of Pittsburgh. I spent 30 long years with the city of Pittsburgh. Part of that was the mental health workers, those persons who had those interventions, trained the officers specifically. So we had those officers who worked in tandem with the Resolve team members. And then not only were they partnered up, so we knew each other, we knew how they might respond, we knew what where there might be some gaps and how we could support each other and strengths around communications and things of that nature, but also to the healthcare system in Pittsburgh had reserved spaces, in-home spaces or in-house spaces that if an officer was bringing an individual who was in crises with a Resolve member, they automatically were guaranteed bed space. That is huge because the majority of time you either have to transport someone across another catchment area, which is a challenge. You don't feel comfortable in your community, right? When you've been transported 5 hours away, you don't feel supported by your community. You almost feel exiled by your community. These programs are highly effective. Also, more than 10 years ago, I hired a social worker and embedded that social worker in the police station. I wrote a grant to get that social worker in there because the officers were going to these calls over and over again where we could see a person was in crises, but they didn't have enough of those wraparound support services to move them through the crises. So if they were in mental health crises, they may also at that point be experiencing a financial crisis, unable to go into work, or maybe not even be able to fill out the paperwork that would allow them to apply for disability or Social Security. So we embedded that social worker, and I'm going to probably get boos and hisses from the structured system, but I did not allow that social worker to have direct contact with like Health and Human Services or Child Protective Services, because then people would not cooperate if they thought that that information was going to go into a database that might reduce their benefits, that might reduce their funds, that might reduce some other programs they were applying for. And the only exception was is if someone was in an immediate health crisis or a danger to themselves or another person. But there are healthy ways to support the community through foundation work. The government doesn't have to continue to be the only resource that we have. And there's also interventions that communities have. There's resources in the community that we're not tapping into where people are willing and wanting to help, but we discount them because they don't have a degree behind their name, that they don't have some credentials or pedigrees, and instead we discount their lived experiences as being a peer navigator and helping them through their crises.
Davida, maybe you can speak to that. How important is community support? Davida, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if you're, first of all, when you talked about at the end, we were gonna talk about solutions, that's my number one.
You can share them with us now. We're getting.
Okay, I'm gonna share them with you now so I make sure I get them in because I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. I'm out of my league here, so let me do this. The first thing is if you can have a liquor store on every corner, you can have a healing center in every community. And you need a safe place and a safe space for Black space. It has been so long since so many Black people have had a belly laugh. I'm talking about from deep inside, because there is so much going on. There is so much that people don't understand. There's all this intergenerational trauma. You need a safe space. And I worked when I came to Minnesota for Aruba Emotional Health Services. She also started a healing center in North Minneapolis. And that's what you need. You have to bring in community experience. I have experience that I can share with all kinds of people. I've been through the police coming to my house to get me because I was in a crisis and how that worked. I know about intergenerational trauma. I know how it continues on. And we need a safe space for that to happen. That's number one. Number two, and at first I said loan forgiveness, the hell with loan forgiveness. You need to get Black people who want to be therapists and psychiatrists and give them the money to go to school based on them willing to work in the community, because the community needs this kind of support that we have not had. And number three is every household in this country needs to have a computer. If we can do $1,200 stimulus checks, we can buy everybody a computer, because when I was in the hospital 3 weeks ago, I had my blood test results before the doctors treating me had it, because I have my chart. We need to have medical literacy the same way we have digital literacy. People need to be able to read whatever their program is. Here is my chart. I know what's going on. I know how I've been diagnosed. I know what doctors say I should do or shouldn't do. The whole thing of I have chronic pain and how doctors deal with chronic pain. And I've had to fire doctors because I'm sorry, doctors work for me. I don't work for them. They work for me. I hire them. My insurance pays them. So I need somebody who understands where I'm coming from. So for me, it's putting healing centers. I'm a member of Interact, and it's a program for artists with disabilities. And I don't even use disabilities anymore. I just use differently able. I'm not disabled, I'm differently able. And you have to recreate the narrative. What I try and do and what I did with clients was rewrite the narrative, because history has lied about us. It has continued to lie. This is 2020, it's still lying. We have to rewrite our narratives. And so you have to be guided through that. And that's community work. We need to have healing centers and healthcare centers and mental health centers in our communities the same way we have liquor stores and barbecue joints. I'm sorry, that's it.
Rita, I love your suggestions. I'm going to make sure I got them right. No, so number one, healing centers, safe spaces in every community. Number two, grants and scholarships for young people in those communities to study to become psychologists, doctors, social workers.
Right.
And they're grants forgiven as long as they come back and work in the community.
Right.
And computers for every household. Those are great suggestions.
Every household, yes. We saw it with the pandemic.
Yeah.
When students had to stay home, all of a sudden it was perfectly, we were perfectly capable of putting tablets and computers in everybody's home. Why can't we do that outside of a pandemic? Why do we have to wait until something drastic happens to do what we should have been doing in the first damn place?
So I'm going to turn to Dr. Dudley now. That's fantastic. All of those suggestions, absolutely fantastic, Davida. Dr. Dudley, I didn't get your take earlier on the role that protests play in therapy. Like, is it therapeutic to go through all of this as a community, as an individual? And secondly, then I would also like you to give your recommendations on how we can make this better going forward.
Well, I think it directly relates to what some of the others were saying, that it's about community. It's about sharing that experience and the frustration and anger and pain that's being experienced. I mean, that's one important way to manage so much of that. It's managing it through community, through the community getting together and saying, we want to be treated as a human being. We want to be treated as human beings. That's all we're really asking. We're not asking for anything special. And to be able to get together and say that, and the affirmation and support of each other that comes from joining together to do that, I think it's extremely important. It helps people to manage the pain that each of us individually experience by looking at that tape, the George Floyd tape. I mean, we had to do something, or it would have just driven each of us individually quite crazy. I mean, I'm an old guy, and in my life, I've seen a lot of police misconduct reports and cases, but there was something special about that tape. That it's the first time that you really got to see the look on the officer's face, the look on Mr. Floyd's face as he was being killed. And it was impossible to escape what that was about. Well, maybe this, maybe that, when all you saw was like a flashing second of someone being shot or whatever. But what you saw there was just so overwhelming that I think it's generated this very different and much more dramatic response because of the clarity of it. But I think that points to, in answering your second question, I really think that change comes from that kind of intimate involvement where you really get to understand another person and what their life is. And when that really hits you, then you begin to ask those sorts of questions that we see companies and groups asking themselves now, which is, how did I not know this? And how did I participate in keeping the status quo the way that it's been? And what's my responsibility to do something different? That grows out of being hit at a very intimate level, not just kind of up in your head someplace in an intellectual level. So I would say that for police departments or corporations or whoever's trying to change, to number one, recommendations that they need to recognize that it's a process. It's something that they will always be involved in, just like the chief said. And it grows out of having some real exchange with people in the community, some real exchange with people from different ethnocultural groups, where you actually get to know what their lives are like and what their experiences have been in relationship to you. And I think that what grows out of that becomes obvious sorts of things. I mean, if you really get to know, as was said just a moment ago, is if you really get to know the Black community, you know that there's strengths within it. That there are community-based healers. There is support there. It's just kind of how do you harness that as part of your intervention to deal with, whether you're dealing with a whole range of mental illnesses, but also how do you deal with that? How do you harness that to better protect the children exposed to, so that they can take those scholarships and go off to become mental health professionals of their own. And so you would learn that. You would also learn, I think, if you're police, you'd begin to appreciate, what you're doing in these communities that could make matters worse instead of making matters better. And whether it's how do you interact with people from the community so that you're not further traumatizing them? How do you interact with them in such a way so that you're not escalating problems instead of helping to calm problems? I think it would be more obvious what should the police be involved in, as the chief was saying, and what should they not be involved in. I mean, it's not just the obvious mental health problems, right? I mean, it's like when they go in on domestic violence calls and things like that. And here are these little kids over in the corner, watching their parents fight, obviously traumatized by it, and nobody's even concerned about what impact that's having on them. What should we be doing about those sorts of things? And is that an issue for the police, or is that an issue for, as the chief was saying, that you start embedding people in the department, or is it some other group of people who should be handling those sorts of things? But those are questions that I think would be obvious for a police department to ask if they were actually tuned in to what was going on in their communities.
Absolutely. Dr. Vasan, I wonder if you could weigh in on we're addressing so many huge issues here: protests, racism, policing, mental health. The one huge issue we didn't quite hit is the pandemic, right? I mean, if you add that into our conversation, you recently sort of defended the protests, even in light of the pandemic. Talk about the health implications, if you could, quickly, of protesting, of not protesting, and why you defended them during the pandemic.
Right. No, that's a great question. And, you know, it's been interesting and not altogether unsurprising to see public health kind of thrown under the bus, and for people to say, you know, you supported these protests because they fall in line with your political beliefs, but you didn't support those other protests back in April when people were protesting lockdown. And what I say to that is, we were against those protests in April because we didn't know as much as we knew about the virus as we do in June. We didn't know what, we were still thinking it was passed on through physical contact, through surfaces, through, we didn't know that there was a massive difference in outdoor versus indoor transmission. Now we know that. And so essentially, and we were still in the upward part of the curve of the pandemic. So as an epidemiologist, that's exactly the time you want to be the most strict. And now we're, particularly in New York, but all over the country, well, sadly not all over the country, but you know, particularly here in New York, we are very much at the bottom side of the curve if we can keep it that way. And so protesting at a very basic level, at a very public health level, it was very clear to me that this didn't present a undue public health risk. And I think we're seeing the data bear that out, right? The most recent study that just came out 1 month after the protests started showed that there hasn't been a meaningful increase in cases in places that had the largest protests. So that's just one piece. But the bigger question here is, why is it that public health experts like myself were supportive of the protests? Because we're protesting the exact same racism in our country that is leading to the disproportionate number of cases and deaths in the Black community and in Black and brown communities across the country. And so the same systems that killed George Floyd, the same systems that all of the different social crises I mentioned when I started, the same systems that are driving those structural inequalities are exactly the thing that are driving the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people of color. And so it felt, and it is very consistent for a public health person to step in and say, look, you're actually getting to the root of the problem, right? You're getting to the root of the problem, which is racism is leading to structural inequities that are really just getting blown open by this pandemic, right? The virus itself doesn't discriminate, but we do as people. And because of that, you know, and unless we step in and try to close those gaps, especially now during the worst of it, we're going to continue to have the brunt of this pandemic fall on the backs of people of color. And so the protests were simply a manifestation of that.
So important, all of that news. Now, I think I'm going to turn now to some of the questions from the audience. We have a question from Jonathan, who is asking, can the panel discuss A, innovations or best practices in trauma-informed services training for law enforcement, and B, whether there is room for interdisciplinary training, given that certain sectors may be slightly more advanced in this, but could also benefit from the cross-sector dialogue. So Chief Brackney, do you want to try and tackle that first?
Sure, I'll solve the weight of that one right now, right? So I think that sometimes we think of these as isolated type of innovations that, it can only be helpful in policing, right? If we all performed our professions or our jobs from a trauma-informed care perspective, can you imagine how much more quickly our society could heal? And it's not just, sometimes we think about it, you're right, just as these initial interactions out in the communities. If my detectives and officers are dealing with victims from a trauma-informed perspective, right, that they may be adding to that cumulative trauma, then they're going to be much more intentional about how they ask a question, who's asking the question, where you're asking those kind of questions. And if we get them to the hospital, and it starts there. Milwaukee started a program. Now I attended that training more than 7 years ago now on trauma-informed investigations. starting with homicides or shootings, that from the first moment someone came in contact with them, whether it was the EMT personnel or the emergency room staff, that if you started right from that moment understanding how a person might be cared about and how this was impacting their entire family or that community, you would go about your work differently. So I would think that we should have trauma-informed care across the board. And these are interdisciplinary. Just an example of those experiences in my family. My husband's a professor, and he teaches on the Atlantic slave trade and lynchings and slavery and the narratives pushing back. My daughter just finished grad school and graduated with her degree in clinical mental health counseling. So Davida, I'm looking for somebody to pay her student loans.
There you go.
So literally, the way interdisciplinarily, the three of us work together to do work in our communities. And our communities are those Black and brown communities that I grew up in, that I came from. I keep telling everybody I've been nothing but a Black woman all my life. Can't change it. Take the uniform off, still Black woman, right? Husband from Jackson, Mississippi. He's still a Black man when he gets done. And if our daughter, she ain't got any other choices but to be Black too. So what I'm suggesting is as we think about all of the ways in which we come together to support a resilient community, a healthy and a thriving community, we are going to have to move out of those areas where we are comfortable into some other person's space and be willing to hear from experts like Dr. Dudley and Dr. Vazen and Ms. Kilgore about how we can best do our work. We can't be isolated and think that we know how to do this.
Is that about creating separate, units within a police department, or just expanding the training for each police officer? Because Robert is asking, why are the police called into every situation when they aren't trained for every situation? He wants to know, why isn't there a racial protest squad deployed to protests, or a mental health squad for homelessness and people who have mental health issues? So in other words, do you think it's important to keep that under the umbrella of the police department and just create specific units, or should it be totally separate?
So if you think about it, then why would you even want to house it in the police department, right? So if we're going to reimagine this, we don't want to stay in the same places, right? If we're reimagining it, it sounds like we're expanding duties and responsibilities of police. And that's what we're not saying that we should be doing, right? Let's reimagine something so that this is a system that works for everyone. I think there should be baseline training for all of these issues. But that doesn't mean that they're going to ever become experts in this. I don't think any social worker is ever going to become an expert if they're with me. And how do they use a weapon? How do they pursuit drive? And nor should we want them to, right? Even though they may sit in a car with us. So I think if we put those skill sets and those abilities and that knowledge in with those experts, there may be a way to embed them into that versus trying to make a police officer into a social worker, no more than trying to make them into an accountant. We wouldn't do that.
Right. It's funny, I just mentioned this Cahoots again. I was reading up on it today, and each team that responds to a mental health crisis consists of a medic, either a nurse or an EMT, and a crisis worker that has at least several years of experience in the mental health field. So can you imagine if a unit like that had showed up to, Deborah Danner's door or George Zapantis's door, the outcome would have probably been radically different. Dr. Dudley, do you want to weigh in on these issues of law enforcement, mental health, and community?
I agree with what the chief was saying, that when you really think some of this through, there are clearly functions that maybe shouldn't be in the police department at all. And then there are functions that should be in the police department. And then there's probably functions that need some cooperative engagement between other sources and the police department.
So you're saying there should still be a certain amount of training that every officer is familiar with.
Right. Because, you're never going to have a situation. I mean, even if you take certain sorts of things and remove them from the police department, So even if you define mental health in the most narrow way, you know, those who have been diagnosed with major mental illnesses, as opposed to thinking about abuse and neglect and domestic violence and all these other things that have mental health implications, you can't necessarily expect the triage to happen out there. In other words, some of those cases is going to be somebody acting up in the street. The police are still going to be called. You know,
Right.
whoever's calling is not going to say, oh, this is obviously a mental health problem. Let me call the separate mental health squad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have officers who can recognize what's going on, and they call the
So
Right. Tanya, I'm sorry, Tanya, could I jump in just a second? Would that
absolutely,
be okay?
absolutely.
I remember one instance in my life where the police were called on me. And I was in my house just really just out of it completely undressed, didn't know what was going on. So I think part of it is we have to go back and look at the history of how police have responded when we talk about where they should go now. Because the police officers who came to me didn't have a clue of what to do. All they knew to do was to put some clothes on me and put me in the back of a squad car. So at least they protected my safety. I believe you have to give a little bit of credit where credit is due, because I don't know what would have happened to me if that hadn't happened. But it's the thing of riding in a squad car. Is that the best way to take me from being completely nude to barely dressed to a hospital? Is that the best way to go? Is there another vehicle? I mean, is there something that takes away the stigma of I live with bipolar disorder? I don't necessarily need it announced, but now it's been announced and my friends know and it's out in the open and the police knew. But is there some other way from getting me? Deborah Danner was a friend of mine. So is there a way of getting from this is what happens to you, this is how you're taken, you know, how are you physically taken to where you need to go? In what vehicle are you taken to where you need to go? And what happens when you get there? So you have to go back. I believe in if you don't deal with history, you're gonna repeat it. So it's a matter of what has happened in the past and where we can go now. So I didn't mean to jump in, but that was really important for me because
You had a personal experience with what we're talking about. So I'm so glad
right.
that you shared that. And Dr. Vasan, I'm wondering if you could also weigh in on this issue of, because as Mark, one of the audience members is asking, you know, is there a way that clubhouses can team with law enforcement? So I'm wondering, have you reached out to anyone, you know, the local precinct where Fountain House is or any of the precincts? Have you worked in tandem at all with the NYPD?
Increasingly, yes. I mean, we're building programs for diversion from courts, diversion from law enforcement, and obviously after reentry from incarceration. But the bigger question is, you know, number one, who's responding in moments of crisis? Number two, what are the options that police have when they do have to respond? What I see is a lack of options in those moments. And so it's like everyone's heard the adage, if you give a carpenter a hammer, everything's a nail. And that's what ends up happening. People end up in jail or they end up, you know, with a worse outcome because there aren't partnerships to say, all right, who's in the community that understands how to de-escalate, care for, wrap around with services, and really mitigate the effects of crises in those acute minutes and hours, and that can, in a way, take some of the responsibility and the burden off of me, Officer X, in those moments, and trust that I know that this person will be safe, that others will be safe around them, and that's my job. My job is to maintain safety, and then I'm out of the picture. That doesn't really exist yet. There are attempts. There's attempts in the NYPD. There's attempts in, and certainly models like Cahoots are wonderful, right? Because in the thousands and thousands of calls, tens of thousands of calls they get every year, only a small fraction require a law enforcement official to actually arrive on the scene. And so who actually comes through the door or meets someone on the street in that first encounter is so important. But I also want to add that, what we're seeing here is a byproduct of a breakdown of our safety net, right? Which is why we are, I mentioned all those intersectional policy problems up front. This is not just a question of, yes, it is a question of maybe defunding the police, redirecting responsibilities, redistributing resources to the appropriate agencies. But we need to be asking ourselves, why are there so many people out of care, in crisis, at risk for crisis? And how are we dealing with that in the moment, or as this epidemic is going to lead to, an expansion of those numbers? There are 240,000 people in New York City alone who live with chronic serious mental illness. About 40% of those, 93,000 of them, are in no care at all. No care. So the responsibility there is not with the police or anyone else. It's with our healthcare systems. It's with our housing authorities. It's with our education systems. It's with the lack of the kind of healing centers or fountain houses or other community-based mental health projects that are available. And that requires serious conversation at an intersectional high level, and then investment. And it's not going to, defunding the police alone is simply that first encounter, but it needs to be met upstream with a whole set of investments to really mitigate the lived experience of people living and dealing with mental illness every day.
Well, so to leave everybody with a sense of, what we can all do, how we can be proactive, let's just go through some of the points, because I think we all sort of agree that there should be maybe a CAHOOTS or something like that model in every city that can deal separately with mental health crises. In the absence of that, in the short term, is there a bridge that can help until we get to that point? As you said, there is a high level change that needs to happen, which is voting in new representatives or voting in new leadership that sees this as a priority, right? But in the absence of that, what can we work on in the short term that can help until every town has a CAHOOTS or a similar model? Is there a baby step that we can take till we get there? Chief Brackney, what do you think?
So yes, so everyone's been talking about that 911 call. We're like, what happens at that 911 call? And Dr. Aswan was very eloquent in his descriptions of all the systems that have broken down. So what I just tasked our team with doing is to create a computer model. And we are just pulling out our mental health or our crises responses, the 911 calls and the number of those that we've done, right? And let's look at those persons who have been heavy consumers of the system. And once we've identified them, we know that if they are likely to be in crises consistently, what might our responsibility be to reach out to social service agencies here, our mental health resources here, to say, listen, is there a possibility that we connect you in advance so that we already know how to start working with them so that we can disrupt the trajectories when we're at the point where someone's dialing 911? We shouldn't get to that point. We know who those persons are. So if we want out of that responsibility, as I say, as we redistribute those responsibilities, that's one of the things that we're doing here. That's going to take some work. Because that comes with certain things, like when a person is in crisis, when we're interacting with them, asking them, is it okay if we refer them or put them in contact with, right? It's also making sure that we have well-resourced and well-published resources that we might be making those connections. And we're assigning individual officers to be the person who's responsible for making sure, let's make sure we mine our data in a way that's healthy. Everyone wants data about, all these other things, but we have a responsibility also to look at who we're intersecting with and how can we ensure that we're providing the best service for that person who has called 911 to disrupt trajectories before they occur. So that's something we're doing right now here in the department.
Excellent recommendations, excellent recommendations. And Dr. Dudley, in terms of an individual, a member of a community, what is something that, you know, we can each do? I mean, one of the audience members asks, do you feel that mental health first aid, sort of a CPR for mental health, is something that everybody should know how to do? Are there things that everyone should recognize as a sign of mental health issues in their community so that each individual can recognize it? Would you say, you know, Dr. Dudley, that we're all responsible members of our own community and should be on the lookout for the people in our community?
I think that's certainly the case, and we should be looking out for them, and that's what a community is. It takes care of itself in that sort of way. So I would say that in addition to this issue about whether there's, you know, kind of adequate funding and support of services in the community, mental health services and other public health services and other services that a community might need, it's important to focus on the fact that that services that exist and services that would be added to the community are designed in such a way so that they're designed specifically to meet the need of that community. And that's what we're really talking about, I think, when we talk about ethnocultural competence. And part of that is making things accessible. So part of that is educating the community about mental health issues, because that's part of making services accessible and available to them. And using community-based healers, using a variety of other things as bridges and entry points and access points to services. That's part of what makes services available. That's part of what makes them relevant to the needs of a particular community, that they're designed in a way to capture and inform and educate and engage and actually be able to help a particular community. So we use the basis of what we all know maybe about mental health, but we design it in such a way and work with it in such a way to meet the needs of a particular community that's being served. So,
sorry, go ahead, Dr. Dudley.
No, so I think you're right. I mean, so part of that is education.
Right. And so, David, I was wondering that you could tell everyone, what does it look like? What does mental health look like, or mental illness look like? How do you recognize it in your neighbor so that you can have empathy?
I think what it is recognizing it in yourself first. I have to give credit where credit is due. I had a professor, Dr. Bashan, who said she had clients who wanted a Black therapist. She didn't know any. And she's the one who convinced me to go to grad school in the first place. And then I had my unit worker at Fountain House, Susan Lieblich, who said, you gotta stay in the trenches. And part of it is I can recognize in other people what I see in me. I had a client who I came to work, was laying on the sidewalk, and the decision was, do I call 911 or do I deal with this person where they are? And I decided I did that. Social work Adams, I forget her first name. And it was, I know what he's going through. Let me pick him up off the ground, take him in my office. He reenacted the trauma, and I deal with a lot of improv and a lot of writing and a lot of art when I'm working with clients. And it was like, do I really need to call 911? Or can I deal with this person right where they are? And I dealt with him right where he is, because I don't believe you need to call 911 for everything. Some of it is you just simply need to know who you are. Like Susan said, you have to be willing to stay in the trenches. You have to be able to sit with the silence. You have to be able to exist with somebody's trauma. And when you can give them all of that, when you can just sit there and let them reenact what they need to reenact, and just be there and provide a safe space and put your arms around somebody and say, it's okay. Half the time you don't need 911. You just need to let somebody work through what they're working through at that moment and take it from there. And then you can make a decision. Do I need to call their doctor? Do I need to call the police? Most of the time, no. You call the doctor, you call their therapist, you get their meds checked, you know, you do what you do. But because of my own mental illness, I can see it in other people. And so I don't have to run and immediately say 911, because that brings in a whole nother, it becomes criminalized. And mental illness is not a criminal offense. Diabetes is not a mental offense. Kidney disease, which I have, is not it's not a criminal defense. Mental illness is just what it is. It's a chemical imbalance in the brain, depending on what you have. It is what it is, and recognize it in other people and treat them as people, and know that basically the ground root is some kind of trauma. Let them work out the trauma and rewrite their own narratives. And that's where I am with it.
Thank you so much, Davida. So Dr. Vassan, maybe you could end by then helping us all understand what mental health sometimes looks like in an effort to stem the tide of 911 calls, or, you know, as Chief Brackney was saying, so many of these problems start out with a 911 call. So can you explain what we should all be familiar with so that maybe you don't, like Davida just said, make that call?
Well, I mean, so number one, I want to thank everyone for this conversation. And, you know, I don't think I could sum it up any better than Davida just did from a personal experience. But what I would say is the thing that both the doctor and Davida mentioned, as well as the chief, is you have to be engaged in your community. If the 911 call is obviates your need to actually get engaged in your community, then it's not going to work. You have to be a participant in your community, engage with the people in your community, and you'll get to know who are the folks struggling and who are the folks not struggling. You know, we're at a time of unprecedented crisis and economic stress and all of these other stressors as a result of the pandemic, and people are hurting. People are hurting, and yet we're seeing communities step up with programs like mutual aid and a whole host of other supports that are just person to person, people to people, neighbor to neighbor. And that's a way to start, because you'll get to know very quickly who's really struggling, who's not struggling, who's at risk, who's got pre-existing mental illness. You don't need to be a therapist, a doctor, a psychologist to know who's hurting. We all are able to recognize pain. We should be able to recognize pain if we're in touch with our own pain. So I would say, you know, getting engaged, particularly at a moment now, even on something that is completely unrelated to mental health, that is just simply, I want to do something at a food bank, I want to do something in my community to support people who are really struggling. That's going to give you that basic foundation of engagement and empathy that you need to then, when a crisis comes along, to react a little bit more like what Davida is talking about, rather than I'm going to press those 3 buttons and walk away and hope that someone else takes care of this. Because there's number one, there's no guarantee that it's going to get taken care of in that way. But also number 2, what have you done to help? What have you done to really redirect someone's trajectory or to affect their life in a positive way? And so we all have to be better neighbors, better friends, better community members during this moment of crisis and during this moment of stress, which isn't going away anytime soon. You know, we're just at the beginning of this pandemic, and we're going to be living with this virus for the next several years, I would imagine. And so it's got to in the same way that we're asking our systems to fundamentally change, to address structural racism, to address policing, to address the way that we deal with mental health, we need to be demanding that of each other and of ourselves to really change the way we interact with each other. We can't be atomized, individualist, isolationist people anymore that live in our bubbles. We've got to engage if we're all going to get out of this together.
Wonderful, wonderful advice. I think we have a pretty clear vision of how we'd like to see things change going forward. And I think it's fantastic. I think everything that each of you has outlined is just so important and so crucial. You've been so generous with your time, and this has gone over because it's such a fascinating topic. If anyone has any last final words that they'd like to add, please let me know, and we can go to you.
I just would
So
like to
I-
add from
Oh, we're all jumping in. This is an assertive group. This is an
I would just
assertive
like-
group.
from a public health perspective, I think the other thing to not overlook when we're talking about mental illness is that, you know, what we would want the goal of services in a community to be is to promote health as well, and to really, whether it's the police or whatever, you know, how can we do things in a way to enhance people's mental health across the board, so that, and I think that's an important aspect of this that I wanted to make sure that we added.
Absolutely.
Well, this one is kind of two-sided. One, I actually started working on my doctorate, and I was doing my dissertation on Black women therapists working with Black women clients. And so self-care became really important and working with that. But the other thing is, and this is real cheesy, but Chief, I don't know where your daughter is working, but when I was in New York, they had a lottery for people who were working with marginalized communities, and they were giving you $4,000 a year to pay off your student loans. So I don't know, you know, exactly what may be going on where you are, but have your daughter check into that depending on where she works, because they do have those programs.
You know, Mama got on that. Quit playing. So yes, and you know what? Thank you for that. And my final thought is, I always tap back to. So we talk about issues of racism and mental health and policing, and we've couched them under protest, right? A very dear friend of ours is a professor at Penn State University in Pittsburgh area. They have these campuses, and it's Professor Jonathan White. And here's what he said to me, and it's always framed the way I've thought about the way I engage around demonstrations and rallies, that protest is the most powerful expression of powerlessness. And when you are at the point where you are protesting about your lack of power, it is a lack of power feeling helpless around racism, around mental health, around our economies collapsing around us. It's feeling as though we have no other place to go except to be resigned to our current situation. Then you know what? That is the only time that I really will embrace protest as a very powerful, positive expression of what we're attempting to do in this nation right here and right now.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, I think if we could all take that energy and move forward, you know, we'll have a better society for sure. Dr. Vasan, do you want to say final goodbyes to everyone?
Again, I just want to thank everyone for making the time, taking extra time, and for talking about something that's both personal to each of us, but also just really pressing for our country. You know, we talked about what can individuals do. In the short term, we have a lot of systems redesign to do. And if there's ever a moment to redesign systems, it's now at a moment of great crisis when those cracks are opening up. But the one thing we can do in the very short term is vote. Get out, vote, get to the polls. No matter if anyone tries to stop you from getting to the polls, particularly our Black brothers and sisters and brown brothers and sisters, we need to vote. Vote, vote, vote with your feet, vote with your actions. And, you know, make sure people are paying attention. Vote for the candidates who are talking about human security and the human condition in a way that resonates with you, because there are choices out there. And if we want to set ourselves out on a different path come November or any time else, we've got to have people in power who are able to hear that from us, and so that we don't need, you know, hundreds of thousands of people on the street to get people to pay attention, that they're actually having those conversations in the halls of power. So I encourage everyone to vote.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. Our amazing panel of experts, all of you who are out there listening to this and who've stayed with us over almost an hour and a half. This has been such an illuminating conversation. I feel so enriched by it. So I thank you all so much for coming together for this. And I hope that we will meet again soon.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank
Be well.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.